Good afternoon, and welcome to the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the Friends Lecture Series. My name is Barbara Proschel, and I am president of the Friends of the Institute. It is a lovely fall day outside, so thank you for coming inside to join us. Our speaker today is Professor Howard Louthan, who is the director of the Center for Austrian Studies and a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. Professor Louthan is going to transport us virtually to the city of Prague and the famous Charles Bridge. But first, a word from our sponsor. This lecture is presented by the Friends of the Institute with generous support from the Mark and Mary Goff-Vitterman Fund. And if you will note some of our upcoming Friends events on the screen, we have a member-only tour to the Landmark Center and Schubert Club. And please note that our next lecture is coming up very quickly on Sunday, November 10th, and that will be with Jody and Susan Falwell, who are innovative potters from the Santa Clara Pueblo. And you may have actually noticed they have an exhibition on, just on the main floor in the Cargill Gallery. On Friday, November 15th, and then the following Saturday, the 16th, we will have our Friends Book Club and tour, and they will be discussing The Country of the Blind, a memoir at the end of sight by Andrew Leland. So just a quick reminder to please silence your cell phones. And during the question and answer period, please wait for the mic so that everyone can hear you. All right, now I am going to introduce Tom Rassieur, who will in turn introduce Professor Louthan. Tom is probably a very familiar face to some of you in the audience, and he is a popular figure in the halls of MIA. He asked me to keep this very brief, and so here goes. Tom Rassieur joined the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 2009. He is the John E. Andrus III Curator of Prints and Drawings, period. I will also add that Tom's exhibition, aptly named Dark Visions, is up in Gallery 344 until December 8th. You will see some interestingly scary images from the Romantic period, just in time for Halloween. So with that, please help me welcome Tom Rassieur to the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. I want to begin by thanking the Friends. It's through their aegis that we have such a wonderful lecture series here at MIA, and they do so much to help bring new faces to the museum, especially through their support of the busing program and for school children, and they support the museum in many other ways, including acquisitions of wonderful works of art. And I celebrate the fact that they recently finished paying off the Delacroix painting which of the beautiful flowers that are upstairs. So the Friends are a wonderful organization. If you're not a member already, I suggest you join. So Howard Louthan and I got to know each other really a few years ago when I was working on a Luther exhibition, and that was held here. And Howard has turned out to be a very welcoming guy. And as a result, my connections to the U were strengthened, and I really found that Howard is a guy who makes connections everywhere. Howard's been a professor at the U since 2014, and if you look at his resume, which I've only printed out a fraction of it here because I ran out of paper. What you see is that he's won a number of awards, not just for his scholarship, which is extensive. He's published and edited over a dozen books and dozens and dozens of articles. But he's received awards not just for his scholarship, but also for his teaching. And I think that's it really speaks well of him. It's a wonderful combination. And the way that it was through the Center for Austrian Studies, of which Howard is the head, that I went over to the U with in conjunction with the Luther exhibition, and it opened a whole new world to me of a scholarly community that was devoted to the history of Central Europe, the Habsburg Empire, the modern Austria, the remains of the former Austrian Empire, etc. And as chief of this organization, Howard acts as the general editor for scholarly publications, and he brings people to Minneapolis to speak on a very regular basis. And as you are all lecture goers, I can tell because you're here today. And so I suggest that you get on the Center for Austrian Studies mailing list, and you'll be amazed at the terrific people that Howard brings to the city. So all I want to do is say welcome a friend, a scholar, and a true treasure in the Minneapolis community, Howard Louthan.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I want to thank the friends. I want to thank Tom, and I want to thank Mia more generally. What a treasure we have. I think it's far too easy to take this institution for granted. As Tom said, I've been here for about a decade, and it's a wonderful collection. But, I would stress the importance, at least for me as a professor at the university, of Mia is its openness and its accessibility. And its ability to share art in so many different ways. And that's just such a treasure that we have here, that it's a great honor to be here, and maybe a small way that I can say thank you as well to Mia. So with that said, let's get to our topic today. Here is an image of Charles Bridge. We'll be looking at this obviously in greater depth this afternoon. I want to start, though. I was sort of asked to say, is there a sort of an image at Mia? Is there an object that you can start with that might do a nice sort of segue into all these wonderful Baroque statues that we'll look at? And there is. In Gallery 308, there is a marble statue about half a meter tall by the Italian artist, sculptor Giacomo Antonio Ponzanelli. I'm showing this statue for three reasons. The first is we'll be looking at a lot of Baroque statuary, so it's a nice sort of segue into that. But the second is a little bit more methodological. Why are we looking at this statue? What does it have to tell us? And I would say, as we look at this statue, and then as we look at the statues in more generally on the Charles Bridge, that it's a terrific example of what you first think you see, you might not really be seeing. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's look at this. At first glance, I think that the image that we might see up here is a very traditional image of the Virgin, Mary, meek and mild. Mary, a friend of all humanity. I would posit, though, we're going to take a little bit closer look at this, that this is not Mary, meek and mild. If anything, it's Mary, mean and militant. Mary, what's going on here? A couple things. Why do I come to that conclusion? Let's see. Let's look at Mary's feet. The real clues are at the bottom. Or what is she standing on? The first thing, there's two items here. The first and most obvious is she's standing on a dragon. Now, this dragon is an image of a representation of Lucifer, the author of all lies, the devil himself, who was thrown out of heaven. And Mary, this is this type of iconography of Mary was very, very common for this period, was seen across the world. Here we have a mid-17th century painting of Mary, the allegory of the triumph of Mary. She is dispatching the dragon right here, along with the help of St. Francis of Assisi. And there's a bit of an apocalyptic edge to this as well, that this is the final judgment of truth and error and truth on the side, right teaching on the side of Mary has won out. So that's the first aspect of this image that I think is important. The second, let's look at what's peeking out of her. It's a little bit more difficult to see, her draperies right there. An image of a crescent moon, a crescent moon. Now, what's the crescent moon have to do with all of this? Well, the crescent moon, and again, this was very common in the iconography of the period, was a symbol of a Mary's immaculate conception, that Mary was born without sin. Now, this is a very controversial, or this was a very controversial teaching within the Catholic Church. It only, I believe, only officially became doctrine in the 19th century. But it's an old doctrine. It's an old teaching that goes back to the very beginning of the Christian Church, back to the actually one of the apocryphal Gospels, the Proto-Gospel of James, if you're interested, which gives some of the details, fills in some of the details about Mary's background. But the idea that Mary was born without sin was one that was quite controversial through most of the history of the church. There were a number of people, Bernard of Clairvaux, some of these names that you may know, medieval theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, who had some questions about this and said, this doesn't make much sense. We're all sinners, and Mary, like us, shares the stain of original sin. This is significant, again, with this idea of Mary meek and mild to Mary mean and militant in a number of ways. We have some very interesting stories about Mary, about this doctrine in the period that we'll look at from the starting in the 16th century. There's a great example in the city of Frankfurt at the cathedral. A Franciscan preacher was there giving the sermon one Sunday, talking about Mary, and in walks his Dominican rival, whom the Franciscan had seen as besmirching Mary's reputation by questioning the fact that she may have been born with original sin. Well, what does the Franciscan do? He's in the middle of his sermon. He stops his sermon. He stares down his Dominican rival. He leaves the pulpit. He picks up a crucifix and literally brains his rival. So these types of doctrines, which might seem kind of arcane, really can lead to some significant violence. There's another great incident from this period, from the Swiss lands in 1509, known as the Jetze affair, when the Dominicans, again, who were skeptical about this whole notion of Mary's Immaculate Conception, staged a series of fake miracles. It's a very complicated story, and they were staging these miracles to, again, besmirch Mary's reputation. It actually backfires on themselves. And, well, this is what happens if you mess with Mary. These guys, at least, ended up at the stake. Things did not end up very well for them. So with that said, this, I think, really sort of brings me to my third reason that I'm showing you this image. This is really an image of Mary as in triumphalistic mode, having defeated her enemies, which means the enemies of the church, which means the enemies of the Catholic Church, and is sort of militantly, triumphantly riding sort of the crest of the wave of a massive Catholic revival that is occurring across Central Europe. And we see a number of these images that are just like that, the image here at Mia to some degree. We see this is the most famous Marian column. It's in Munich. But these columns are also reproduced and come up in other parts of Central Europe as well. We'll be talking about the Habsburgs shortly, and across the Habsburg lands. From Innsbruck to Timișoara in Romania, we have Marian columns that are coming up. So this moment of triumph for the Catholic Church is really very, very important for us. Okay, now let's go and move from the Mia image that we have, this notion of Mary, to the Charles Bridge itself. The Charles Bridge, I would guess that a number of you have been there, and some of you have not been there, but probably have heard of it. Maybe some of you have never heard of it at all. This is one of the most famous tourist landmarks in all of Prague today. And it's been a tourist site, a little bit like Venice, for a very, very long time. We have reports from English travelers from the 18th century going to Prague and just raving about this wonderful bridge that they visited. So it's been a tourist landmark for a very long time. I would say, though, that this is a terrific image that we have here. Very, and they're very atmospheric, right? With the mist and the statues in the background. If you go to Prague, this is most likely not going to be your experience unless you get up at 2 in the morning. It's much more likely that this is going to be your experience. It's a mess. It's fun. It's very carnivalesque, this atmosphere, as tourists and buskers and pickpockets and people just trying to get from one side of the city to the other are running across this wonderful bridge. So let's take a closer look at what's going on here. Now, as I said, here we've got a map here of Central Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the most important family, most important dynastic house, most important sets of princes in this period for Central Europe are the Habsburgs. Here's Prague right here. The Habsburgs have their core conglomerate of territories are in the Bohemian and Moravian lands, the Hungarian lands, and the Austrian lands. So right in this area here in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is the real making of the bridge and its statuary. But if we want to talk about origins of the bridge, we need to go back a little bit further than the 17th and 18th centuries to the actual structure, to what was another great golden age of Bohemia, of Moravia, of Central Europe in this period, a medieval golden age for the city of Prague, and another ruler, Emperor Charles IV, who you see down here, very instrumental in the creation of some very important structures and institutions across the city that gives medieval Prague its distinctive shape. This is the St. Vitus Cathedral. He was also the founder of what is the first university in Central Europe in this period as well. Now, the bridge itself, which he was responsible for, was destroyed in a flood in the 1340s, and he began to rebuild it. Now, in those early years, the bridge did not have the reputation. It didn't have that sort of carnival vibe. It did not have those monuments that I showed you. Here's a picture from the bridge today up to see some of the things that Charles IV created. You see the cathedral up there. Right below the cathedral is the extensive buildings of the royal palace. Charles IV was responsible for some of those as well. And here is an illustration of the Charles Bridge in the early 17th century. And this would have been pretty much what people would have experienced very early on. No monuments. It was very much of a utilitarian, an impressive structure crossing the river. Now, the bridge did not have the greatest of reputations in this early period. It was a place that you wouldn't go to after dark. We have stories of actually 3 priests who, in the 14th century, come to unseemly inns that they are actually tossed off the bridge in this period. So don't go there after dark if you're around in the 14th century. The first monument that we get is actually commemorating one of these events, one of the priests that is thrown off the bridge in this period. It's set up in his memory. Right across, though, from this, you see something here as well. This is the column of justice, because the bridge also served as a place of execution. That it was a public place of execution, that criminals would come out, the headsman would come out and do his job. But again, this lends to its rather unsavory reputation in this period. So this early urban, sketchy, dodgy reputation of don't cross the bridge at night is matched by, I'll try to stay away from as much history as possible, but I need to give you a little bit of background here, is matched by a period of political and religious turmoil that happens in Bohemia in this period. The most famous, perhaps some of you may have heard of him, John Hus, was in some respects a forerunner of Martin Luther. He was a very popular reformer in the Czech lands, but he doesn't come to a very happy end, as you can see right there. With his death in 1415, it happened in the city of Konstanz in southern Germany. That prompted a widespread religious revolt in Bohemia from the Catholic Church and against the emperor. And this period then, starting with the death of Hus, going all the way up to the period that we're going to look at in the second half of the 17th century, was one of significant religious and political turmoil. If Hus, in some respects, is one bookend, the other bookend is another. Prague isn't, there are a couple events that I think that if anybody has a general interest in history may have heard about. This is one of the other famous events, the Defenestration of Prague from 1618. The joke goes that, each country has, its favorite way of executing criminals. And in France, they love the guillotine. We have the electric chair. And in Bohemia, what do they have? They have the window. They throw people out windows. So this was a palace coup, quite literally, when some imperial counselors were thrown out the window. This initiated what was the most devastating war in Europe across the board until World War I. It's been estimated that in some parts of Central Europe, up to a third of the populace died. So not a good time to be in Bohemia in this period. But that's not the time of our that we're talking about as well. Eventually, the 30 Years' War comes to an end. This religious turmoil, in particular, the period that was dabbling with all sorts of non-Catholic Protestant variants, that comes to an end. The Catholic Church, that Habsburg family I just mentioned, they come out on top, and they're ready to build a new city and create a new image for the country and for the kingdom of Bohemia. And that's where the bridge comes in. So let me give a couple remarks about the actual construction that goes in. I should say, just in passing real quickly, back to our first monuments there, that crucifix there, that crucifix sort of mirrors the difficult times that Bohemia was going through at the time. It is destroyed in 1419 by a group of a Hussite mob. There is some skepticism about religious imagery. Let's get rid of that. In the 17th century, it's re-erected earlier than that, but then in the 17th century, there's an English queen who is a Protestant, and she sneers at the crucifix, and she says that naked bath attendant, Jesus, right? What's he doing up there? Well, some people get the hint that she doesn't particularly like it, and they toss the poor crucifix in the river again. So it's the second time that it's destroyed. And so by the time that the Catholics are back in control, they say, enough of this wooden crucifix stuff. The stuff keeps on getting burned down or thrown into the river. We need something a little bit more substantial than that. So they go and they get a bronze monument. Up the river they go, or up to Dresden they go, and they come back with a bronze monument, which they install. The first statue itself is this statue right here that goes up in 1683 of John Nepomuk. I'll come back and talk about him in a bit. He's another interesting character. Two more statues come in the 1690s. And then in the first 2 decades of the 18th century, we get a virtual explosion of images right here, of statues. So here's a great illustration here of altogether there's 28 that go up. There's 30 today. And they all go up in this period. And you can literally, as a tourist, or there's actually devotional guides too that are produced in the 19th century, the late 18th century, that will tell you each statue and what's the story behind the individual there. Now, just a couple observations about this period of construction. The first is that this was a genuinely popular monument. And by that, I mean, there wasn't one group, one individual, an archbishop, a group of Jesuits who had, we've got the master plan for the Charles Bridge, and this is how it's going to look, and we're going to put this statue there and that statue there. Instead, it was much more of a free market economy that was going on. All told, of those 28 statues, there were 9 of them were put up by religious orders, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and others. Let me look at my notes here. I believe it was 6 were put up by civic institutions as well. So there are a lot. The participation is really very, very broad in this period. The second observation I want to make generally about these monuments is that there's a real sense of competition that's going on here. Yeah, again, this sort of free market model, I think, is important just to use as a type of metaphor right here. That the later we go in the construction period, the more elaborate these models become. So if one group puts up one model, it's like, we can do better than them. We'll put something up even bigger and better. So let me give you a couple examples right here. In 1711, the Jesuits put up this towering monument of Francis Xavier, sort of a triple tier of Xavier, and another missionary saint right here. In 1714, this very interesting religious order, the Trinitarians, put up another sort of fascinating, and in some ways a little bit even more elaborate model. There's a prison down here. We'll come back to them right down here, of some unfortunate Christian prisoners in here, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what this order was about. But my point is that this sense of competition, I think, helped spur on the growth and the style of what's going on in this period. Now, I would like to, as we think about the monument, I have 3 general points, or 3 general themes that I want to highlight as we consider the statues. I don't think you want to hear the story behind each of the 28 monuments. I certainly don't. Okay, the first point, though, is I want to talk a little bit about the atmosphere of the bridge. Today, of course, I keep on using the word carnivalesque, and I think that's what it is. It's a big party on the bridge. Well, clearly, from those early days, it had a sketchy reputation. But as the bridge becomes more of a tourist destination and develops, there's another sort of atmosphere that is slowly developing. Let's look at this guy right here. Not a very happy individual. Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer was a dour German, Prussian, I can say this because I do the Austrian world, philosopher, very influential in the development of philosophical pessimism, right? He doesn't look like the happiest individual right there. Well, Schopenhauer came down to, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be too flippant, and I'm not trying to pick on poor Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer came down to Bohemia in the 19th century as a tourist, and he commented that when he saw people crossing the bridge, he said, "The bigoted inhabitants of Prague will consider it the worst sin without least doffing their hats." There was a very clear sort of devotional aspect to the bridge that many of the stakeholders involved in its construction wanted to complement and wanted to develop. So this devotional ritual piety that we see here is really very, very important, and was an important part of what the bridge was all about in these early years. Let's do a deeper dive into one of these monuments and come back to this one right here. The monument to John Nepomuk in 1683. Now, who was this Nepomuk? Nepomuk was one of those unfortunate priests. Remember I mentioned there was 3 of them? Well, he was one of the 3 that got tossed into the river back in the 14th century. But he's not an ordinary individual who gets tossed in the river. They tossed the wrong person, as I think they as they discovered a little bit later on. So let's dive into a story a little bit further right here. And I want to look at this, see this panel right here? This panel gives a little bit of a fuller explanation of who this Nepomuk was. John Nepomuk was a priest. He was a canon, a member of the cathedral community of St. Vitus. But perhaps more importantly than that, he was the confessor of the Queen of Bohemia. And we see him, we see his robes at least, but we see the Queen right here in the confessional booth making her confession. The Queen was actually the wife of, remember, Charles IV, his son, who is not as well remembered as Charles IV. He did not have a particularly great reputation. And one of the reasons he didn't have, at least according to legend, was that he was a rather jealous individual. And he was kind of suspicious of what's my wife saying to that priest in there? Is she admitting to some type of affair? Is she involved in some type of political controversy? So she goes after, the king goes after the priest and tries to put the screws on him and says, tell me what she's saying. And he says, no, I'm not going to reveal the secret of the confessional. This is a sacrament. This is an absolute no-no for a faithful priest of the Catholic Church. Well, the king doesn't like that very much. And poor John, over the bridge he goes, into the river. But once the henchmen of the king sort of toss him into the river, a series of miracles start happening. His body is miraculously recovered. He's taken up to the cathedral where his shrine is. A series of miracles are connected with the shrine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he becomes a major saint, and to some degree a poster boy of what's going on for the Catholic sort of revival that's happening in Bohemia at this period. In fact, his statue, this is a slight variation of this, becomes an object of, it becomes a template, and it's replicated all across Europe. And Nepomuk's cult, though Nepomuk is not very well known today, and I can sort of explain perhaps why, but in this period, he was a rock star of the 18th century as a saint. His cult was across the world. The University of Mexico City was dedicated to him. He was one of the patrons. I think out in Baja California, there was a body of water that was named for him. It's probably been renamed at this point. But it was the Philippines, all over the place. There was a cult to this saint, in large part because it was promoted by the Catholic, by the Habsburgs, who were so sort of zealous in their promotion of it. I have something as well to say about the sculptor, but I think I'm going to pass on that. But it tells us a little bit about the affect of religious art. The sculptor, at least according to him, converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism through his work on that sculpture. But we can come back to that in questions. What I want to do now, though, is move on to my second point. If the sculptor was on the one hand, this atmosphere of religious devotion that we see on the bridge also, I think, is really quite important because it blends patriotic and religious sentiment. It blends patriotic and religious sentiment. Now, let me explain. There was a proverb that circulated widely in this period about the German lands and their vices. And I should say Bohemia was considered there was both German and Czech speakers here at this point, but was often considered as part of the broader German lands. The German proverb goes as follows. Germany is admirably self-sufficient with her vices. She doesn't need to go elsewhere. If she wants her prostitutes, she can go to Swabia. Swabia is southwest Germany today. She can go to Franconia for her thieves. If she wants perjurers, she should head up to Frisia, which is the Netherlands today, right? That's where her perjurers are. If she wants to go to Saxony, that's where, the good old home of Martin Luther, that's where you can get your drunkards, right? With following Luther. And if you want to go to Bohemia, what do you find in Bohemia? You find her heretics as well. So this reputation that I said that really had existed from the time of Jan Hus at the beginning of the 15th century up to the middle of the 17th century, Bohemia is the homeland of heresy. And the Catholic Church wants to change that reputation. So it begins to try to call up a symbol, a series of figures that recall a very different past, a Catholic past. Nepomuk was a very good start of that, right? This heroic Catholic priest. But there are others. So we're looking at right here much earlier figure than this, Wenceslas. This is the good king Wenceslas. He wasn't a king. He was really a duke. And he didn't make it that long. He actually he was martyred really quite early. But the Christmas Carol is great nonetheless. And but anyway, Wenceslas was one of the sort of local saints. There are other ones: Saint Ludmila, Saint Procopius. We don't need to go into all the details. But what's important is that these local saints were blended with more international saints. So we have on the one hand here Saint Wenceslas, but now we also have this is the Dominicans. So Saint Thomas and Dominic are here on one side of the bridge. On the other side we have Saint Francis, so the Franciscans. The bridge in many respects is a Catholic Hall of Fame. When you're walking across it, you're just seeing all the wow. There's some local talent, but you're also seeing the international talent as well. And that was very carefully done. But there's other ways that you could blend religious and patriotic sentiment in this period. And let me show you one other example. Remember that defenestration of Prague that started the 30 Years' War, the first big event in that conflict. Well, Bohemia is also home to really the last event in that conflict. In 1648, there was a very famous siege of the city of Prague when the Lutherans, the Swedish Lutherans, came down and tried to conquer the city as a whole. And what we're seeing right here is an event that happened in July 1648 when the Swedes, who had already controlled the western bank of Prague, tried to get the old town. And to do that, they had to cross the bridge. They do this in the middle of the night, but there's a very famous sort of legend that happens at this point, that a Jesuit in particular was paying attention, and he saw the Swedes coming in, and he rallied a ragtag militia made up primarily of students and others, not normal soldiers, to hold off the Swedes until the normal soldiers could come and try to push them back. And this is as we see, this is the late 19th century. So this memory was very much alive. And we've got our good crucifix here. Remember, it's already been destroyed twice. This is before the bronze one. Well, it goes down a third time, or at least part of it. A Swedish sharpshooter took off Jesus's head. Here it is right here. But the Jesuits were great with making lemonade from lemons. They took the head and they took it back to their college, where it was a relic for decades, if not for decades, and became an important memory of this moment when good Catholics rallied to push back the foreign Protestants across the bridge. So that is very important as well. I also have, and I think we'll pass on this. I can come back to this in questions. Another statue from this period of Saint Vitus and the Lions. And that also is sort of part of this whole process of blending of religious and patriotic sentiment. But let me move, for the sake of time, to my final point. So the first is the atmosphere of Charles Bridge. The second is this blending of patriotic and religious sentiment. The final aspect I want to highlight is the Charles Bridge as an identity marker. I've just highlighted how the bridge melded religious and patriotic sentiment. Bohemian and Moravian Catholics could see themselves belonging to a long heritage of faith along that Catholic Hall of Fame on the bridge. Bohemians are not just heretics, right? We can get past the past 250 years and recover this wonderful legacy that we have. Now, let me continue with this theme and close more explicitly by examining the bridge as an identity marker. Now, I think identity is as often more, at least the same, if not more, about who we are not as who we are, right? We're in the midst of an election season, right? And you know, if you watch the just the adverts on television or whatever, it's many times it's thank goodness. One side is thank goodness we're not like them, right? Or so we know this dynamic, and this is, I think, precisely what is happening on the bridge as well. The bridge are three sets of enemies to good Bohemian Catholics, three sets of enemies to good Bohemian Catholics to remind them of who they are not. So what are these sets? Well, the first is, we're going to go back to, no, we're not going to go back to, we're going to see this statue right here, another quite an elaborate one of St. Vincent Ferrer. Vincent Ferrer was a 14th century Dominican missionary saint. And we see him right here in particular, two groups that he missionizes. One is the Turk, this turban figure down here. And there is an inscription on the bridge, and we see it right here as well, that he converted, well, supposedly converted 8,000 Muslims. That Trinitarian monument that I said before, the Trinitarians are an interesting group. There are, I believe, an 11th century order, 12th century order that was established to redeem Christian captives who had been traveling in the Mediterranean and were taken by Muslim pirates or corsairs and languished in prison or sold off for slaves. So you can see Brother John, the founder of this group right up here with the manacles, symbolizing that, you know, that's his job to free these poor captives as well. So there are a number of references across the bridge to Muslims. There are, moving to our second group, also a reference to the only non-Christian community that existed in late 17th century Prague, that is the Jews. According to a 1702 census, there were 11,500 Jews in Prague's Old Town. That is approximately a fourth of the population. Prague actually there was no city of Prague. There were three separate cities that we consider Prague today. And of that sort of larger metropolitan area, they were about a quarter of the population. So the Jewish presence was really significant here. And there are a number of references to the Jews. I will just highlight just a couple real quickly. Going back to Vincent Ferrer, Vincent was not only a missionary to the Muslims, he was also a missionary to the Jews in Spain. And he had better success, at least according to this monument, than working with the Jews. He converted 25,000 right here that we see here. And in fact, here's a close-up of the actual statue itself, where the rabbi is hand over his heart, is sort of admitting his errors and acknowledging the superiority of Christianity. Now, the final group, actually one other reference here that I'll just mention in passing right here, the back to our crucifix, which is still up there. There was a story as well about a blasphemy case of a Jew that supposedly dishonored Christ, and as a penalty, a Hebrew inscription was raised on the crucifix that proclaimed Christ's sanctity that was paid for by the Jewish community. And there are a few other references as well to Jews on this. Now, to close, I want to highlight very quickly a reference to the third group, which is the Protestants, which is a very interesting one because I dare any of you to go up and down Charles Bridge. You are not going to find, at least directly, a representative of Luther or Calvin or Luther or Calvin's followers or any sort of Protestant variant out there. But as I was doing my research years ago, I kept on coming across references to some of these in some of these sort of devotional literature about the statue of Luther doing naughty things to his bride, who was the former nun, Katharina von Bora, Katie. I kept on saying, where is this? Where is this? Where is this? I finally found it. What it is it's a small statue on the tower of that where the bridge starts, actually. And this is not Luther, but tour guides love to say it was Luther. There are other legends that were connected to it, but this is precisely what it was. And what it is most likely is a medieval student doing, this type of things that medieval students do when they drink too much beer. And this is the woman that he's doing it to, and where the idea is to keep your eye on where his arm is at this point right here. But this shows you sort of the tenor of what's going on at this period, that of this sort of Catholic triumphalism of where you can take a monument like that and say, there's Luther, and there's his wife. So thank you for your attention through this time. I should say just one final image, that the Charles Bridge continues to be a very, very important civic symbol of identity in this period. And this is perhaps the most recent one. This is a new marker of identity. When Prague was locked down during quarantine, during COVID, the first thing that happens, or one of the first things that happens when quarantine was lifted, was that they decided to make they went for a Guinness Book of World Records. Well, I don't know if they did that, but it looks like the world's longest picnic bench right here, going across the whole bridge, where people would get together and bring their food and sort of celebrate the opportunity to be outside together. And what happened? They all got sick. Thank you. Okay, I'm supposed to ask for questions. We have a little bit of time for that as well, folks. I think is there a mic that can go through?
So, Professor, I have a question. You say the bridge and all the statues was to be a tourist attraction, but in the Middle Ages, didn't most people go like 2 miles from home? So who were the tourists?
Right. Yeah, a tourist attraction. Well, very good question. Thank you. Yes, this is not. The bridge becomes a tourist attraction really in the 18th century, when we have and we have accounts of people that are selling medals of Nepomuk, for example. But it's a very elite clientele who will travel in this period. So this is not quite the Middle Ages. This is a little bit later than that. But this is the era of the Grand Tour, when wealthy English nobles would make the trip around the continent. And that's who we hear from. So it's very good for us as historians, because they usually leave long diaries and long comments, and we can go and figure out what life was like in 18th century Prague for an 18th century tourist. Thanks.
When was the last statue?
When was the last statue put up? Okay. Yeah. Good question. There are, as I said before, right now there are 28 statues originally. Today there are 30, We have some statues. There's one of Cyril and Methodius, who are the missionary brothers who brought Christianity from Byzantium to the Slavic world. They're commemorated, I want to say the 1930s, that they go up there. I think that's the last one. I've got some of that data at home, but I believe that may be the last one. Though there are other monuments that go up a bit later as well when things go down. Thanks. Oops. That's correct. That's correct. The statues are made, they were made out of sandstone, and sandstone doesn't do particularly well, does it? And this is one of the reasons I'm showing you illustrations of these, because you can see the details a little bit better. And a number of them are, it's a constant process of taking things down. There is a museum where you can see some of the I want to say original ones or early replicas, because the lifespan of these things, especially if they're outside, is not very long. And Prague, I should say too, is in a little bit of a basin. So it's there are some cities. Krakow in Poland is also in a basin, and just in the whole period with pollution and the acidic nature of all this as well, it had a really very, very damaging impact on the statues. Oh. Right, good question. And I'm going to sort of plead some ignorance on this. I think there was an you couldn't put up something that was completely blasphemous, right? And I think that there's enough, so it's possible to take something down. But there was not, at least for my work, there was not a board that oversaw everything, and you would, here's my proposal, will you accept it, will you not accept it? So that is, it's not the same type of oversight that we would expect today. Catherine. The Prague itself did well during the war. So no, there was no war damage to the bridge that I am aware of. We have somebody here who's a better expert than I am on war damage in Prague, but I think I'm right on that. No, just different times. Yeah, yeah. Just not a good time to be a priest in Prague at this period, or to be a priest with enemies, right? That's it. Yeah. Please. No, it's the it's the Moldau or the Vltava. So you may know the famous tone poem from Smetana, the Moldau, and that's the river. Yeah. Excuse me? I don't think there is significant barge trade that's moving around there. Again, I'm not completely sure. I can always sort of my focus was the 17th century. There wasn't too much trade going on. Well, there was trade going on there, but not the type that we're thinking of today. Yeah. That I believe is early 18th century. It's the article by Alexander Putik, right, Gary, that talks about that as well. Yeah. Who did they pay? Well, I think there was a fine. I think perhaps to the city, but they also had to finance the inscription too. Yeah. And I think we have a question in the back.
Are there any political figures commemorated on the bridge?
Oh, well, lots of them. I mean, is Wenceslas, is Nepomuk a political figure? Is he a religious figure? I mean, I think that was one of my points, that there's sort of a blending of political and religious going on. There are a number of, going back to Nepomuk again. Let's see, we finally see him again. There's a number of stories that are connected to him. I told you the one about sort of the confessor story and get the queen getting all upset about him. He's also, like, if you're all familiar with the story of Thomas Becket and Henry II, The Lion in Winter, right? This, Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, the great movie, right? There's something similar going on there. There's a power struggle between the church and the state. And this Nepomuk was lined up with the church and Jan Jenstein, who was, I believe, the archbishop at the time, and in terms of a power struggle there. And so that dynamic is going on. But these guys are very much political figures, or co-opted and used in a political way as well. Gary? It's Baroque, correct. Right. But that celebration around the figure, he is not canonized until 1719. And it's very interesting that how to make a saint, and in this period, there's a lot of lobbying that goes on. And I could go on for a while. Why we don't know about this figure? Or we don't, it doesn't have the same ring as other saints do. And there's a reason for that too. But the Bohemians and the church leaders were very, very keen to get their man canonized. And so they used what connections they had in Rome and others to push it through as quickly as possible. Now, this canonization takes place in 1719. This is, you may know, the Enlightenment, right? When we become a little bit more skeptical of some of these stories. And one of the individuals in particular who afterwards they tighten up the rules of canonization, and there's some talking back in Rome and other places of maybe we moved too quickly on this one, that not all the stories that are connected to him are credible. And so he kind of disappears a little bit as well. Yeah. Please. Sure. In what sense of? Right. Okay, let's see if I can go back even further. Here he is. Okay, Jan Hus is a very important religious figure in the Bohemian lands, and some have argued that in some sense he was a forerunner of Luther, and certainly one could make that argument generally, though if we get into sort of technicalities of was he really an early Protestant or not, he was he very much became a symbol of resistance to the Catholic Church. He was an advocate of excuse me, of using the vernacular. Many of the things that Luther would do. He was an advocate. Well, he wasn't, but the movement became an advocate of receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist in both kinds and giving it to children, which again might seem why is that significant? But it was a type of push for the democratization of the of this most important sacrament in the church, and so one can sort of see this as pushing out and some of the ideas that are developed more fully in the Reformation are prefigured with Hus, and very, very popular. His ideas elicit the church itself is going through a very difficult period at this time. He is requested to come to a church council. He's given safe conduct. Well, look how safe it was, right? And so actually when Luther was asked to go to different places, they would, chant out, Hus, Hus, are going to end up like this guy as well. But a very, very important figure and remains so in the Czech national consciousness. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, you did. Thank you, everyone, for coming.